Welcome to History That Doesn't Suck. I'm your professor, Greg Jackson, and I'd like to tell you a story. Remember, it is the 5th of March, and avenge the death of your brethren. George Washington bellows out to his troops, at least according to the Reverend William Gordon. While you might have a more balanced impression of the Boston Massacre from our detailed discussion of it in Episode 3, George's words invigorate his mostly New England men. With the prefab defenses and cannons they installed in a single night on the hills of Dorchester Heights, George's men stand ready to take on any troops General Howe dares to throw at them. Below in Boston, General Howe orders 2,000 men to the wharf, where transports await them. They plan to cross roughly 3 miles of the bay's waters in a southeastern direction and land on Castle Island, which is just off the coast of the mainland, next to Dorchester Heights. Now, today a lot of this area, which includes flatlands, has been filled in to create an expanded Boston. In fact, you can drive from downtown to Castle Island, but remember, we are in 1776. Howe's men have to travel by boat. Once on the island, they plan to wait until night falls, then cross the shallow, sometimes dry flatlands between the island and Dorchester Heights, and then attack. But all of this is for naught. As the afternoon passes, a strong southeastern wind blows hard, taking out windows and fences. Snow and rain pour down. Reverend Gordon later wrote, quote, "It was such a storm as scarce anyone remembered to have heard. I concluded that the ships could not stir, and pleased myself with the reflection that the Lord might be working deliverance for us and preventing the effusion of human blood." British Colonel Charles Stewart might not share the Reverend's concern for human life, but he too wondered if this wasn't for the best. To quote him, "God knows whether it was a fortunate circumstance or not, but at any rate so high a wind arose that it was impossible for the boats to take to sea." The colonel tells us that the next day, General Howe and his engineers can see George's army has too strong of a position. The British army will not attack. No battle. Instead, General Howe decides to evacuate Boston. Howe's army raises a flag of truce. George will let them depart in peace. As a result, Howe's men do not burn Boston as they take their leave later that month. In fact, General Howe not only leaves Boston intact, he even evacuates many of the loyalists who fear the wrath of George's army. These include hundreds of women, children, merchants, Harvard-educated men, and other important people like the Boston Latin School's headmaster and a Worcester lawyer named James Putnam, who previously mentored John Adams. I think you have to give General Howe credit. This is a classy move. But not all loyalists make it out. I mean, it's no small task to come up with the resources to move over 10,000 people in a few days, and some just couldn't be accommodated. A few of the loyalists left behind killed themselves. George reacted to this by writing, "One or two of them have done what a great many of them ought to have done long ago." Wait, let him finish. "Committed suicide." Hold on, wait. Let him finish. Seriously, as harsh as that sounds, George clearly should not be taken literally here. All right, he finishes. "Unhappy wretches, deluded mortals. Would it not be good policy to grant a generous amnesty, to conquer these people by a generous forgiveness?" See, George understands what many a good leader does, that to end conflict, you can't just get your way, even if you are the winner. You have to make concessions to the vanquished if you have any hope of establishing a relationship or otherwise creating a society that includes them. Even if you passionately disagree, forgiveness and generous terms are required for genuine reconciliation. Ultimately, General Howe departs Boston with a fleet of 120 ships carrying over 11,000 souls, only 8,906 of whom are soldiers. They set sail on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 1776. And with that, the siege of Boston is over. Chalk one up for George and the Patriots. So we've officially survived the siege of Boston. And I know this might seem weird, but after talking about Boston in almost every episode so far, it's time for us to move on. We're going to get around this episode. First, we're heading down to Philly, It's 1776, and Congress is declaring independence. I'll walk you through the final months of this difficult and not straightforward decision. From there, my ultimate goal is to follow George's losses in New York, but you can't talk about the revolutionary not yet so big apple without mentioning Alexander Hamilton. At least, not since Lin-Manuel has made Alexander great again. So we'll head to the Caribbean for Alex's story, then follow him to New York, where we can meet back up with George when he gets to NYC in April 1776. From there, we'll see some Patriot setbacks, like the Battle of Long Island and the execution of Nathan Hale, as George flees the state and experiences lows he hasn't felt since he was a young and inexperienced colonel at Fort Necessity. Well, we've got quite a story cut out for us, shall we? Philly. So when we came here to check in with Congress in the last episode, we saw that most delegates in 1775 didn't see independence as the goal. Most thought they had a civil war on their hands and that at some point soon they would reconcile with their king. But this belief suffered a fatal blow with King George III's harsh rejection of Congress's olive branch petition in late 1775. Basically, the king's rejection put reconciliation on life support. Thomas Paine pulled the plug in January 1776, and George Washington drove the nail in the coffin by chasing General Howe from Boston in March. We can see this evolution in Congress's views by looking at its actions in March 1776. On March 3rd, 2 days before George even took Dorchester Heights, in fact, Congress sends Mr. Silas Deane across the Atlantic to try and convince France to get in the fight. That's a telling move. See, France wouldn't want to get mixed up in a civil war, and Congress knows that. But a war for independence? That's something different. King Louis XVI might want a piece of that, simply because it's a great chance to stick it to his nemesis, King George III. Silas is even permitted to say there's a good chance, quote, total separation from Britain is coming. So the mere fact that Congress sends Silas speaks volumes to where the delegates' minds are. But don't take that as every delegate agreeing on independence. No, remember, everyone in Congress rarely agrees on anything. Things are only moving in that direction. About this time, we also see independence talk showing up in the letters between John and Abigail Adams. Now, before I quote some Abigail for you, let me fill you in on these two New Englanders who are arguably America's original power couple. Although they live in an era where women are generally pushed to the sides of the limelight of power and politics, make no mistake. Abigail is just as brilliant as John, and he relies heavily on her advice, even when they are separated by John's various roles in government. Like right now, as he's in Philly repping Massachusetts in Congress, they write to each other constantly. Across their half a century of marriage, they exchange an untold number of letters, over 1,000 of which have survived into the 21st century. So just imagine how many more didn't. Their fiery personalities can jump off the page on occasion. All the same, they mean it when they start their letters to each other, as they often do with, "My dearest friend." This is a truly committed relationship, an honest relationship, two best friends who make the other better, sharper. John and Abigail are interdependent. My apologies to everyone who is now feeling badly about their love life. Now let's get on to Abigail's letter. Writing John on March 31st, 1776, Abigail says, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency." Boom. There you go. And should we be surprised? I'm not. I mean, do you remember how she and little John Quincy felt watching the Battle of Bunker Hill nearly a year ago? So of course, she has come to this conclusion, like so many other patriots in New England. But let's not stop her letter there. Always seeing 2 steps ahead, Abigail also tells John that when he and the boys in Congress get around to creating new laws and a new government, they would do well not to leave women on the sidelines, to quote Abigail again. By the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Did I say Abigail sees 2 steps ahead? Sorry, I meant she sees 146 years ahead. Now, don't blame John too much. He'll be in England when the future U.S. Constitution is penned. But women will not receive the right to vote on a federal level until 1920. That's the year when, to use Abigail's words, the rebellion of several generations of American women results in the U.S. Constitution's 19th Amendment, prohibiting federal or state laws from denying the right to vote on the basis of sex. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Back to declaring independence in 1776. Come May, some colonial governments have started giving their blessing to their congressional delegates to vote for independence. Between May 10th and 15th, Congress officially recommends to the colonies, they say the United Colonies, that they bail on their current British monarchy-sanctioned colonial governments and establish basically new patriot governments. To quote, "It is necessary that the exercise of every kind of authority under the said crown should be totally suppressed." More and more colonies are peeling off in support of independence. As this happens, an exuberant John Adams writes to fellow New England patriot James Warren, "Every day rolls in upon us independence like a torrent. What do you think must be my sensations when I see the Congress now daily passing resolutions which I most earnestly pressed for against wind and tide 12 months ago, and which I have not omitted to labor for a month together from that time to this?" Yeah, John's been angling for this for a long time. June 7th is a big day. The Virginian delegate and longtime hardcore patriot Richard Henry Lee proposes independence. The resolution is only 3 sentences long. You need to hear this. Resolved that these united colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connections between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. Woo! This is it, people. We're doing this. Now, in case you missed it in the 18th century lingo, I just want to break down what that resolution said. It was 1. King George and Parliament can kiss our united colonial buttocks. 2. Damn straight we're going to bring foreign alliances into this. We're pulling out all the stops, so quoi de neuf, la France? 3. Now, this one might surprise you, but we aren't getting federal, just confederal. There's a significant difference. This means the colonies will remain independent and sovereign states. To compare that to modern times, think more European Union style than federal United States. Soon, this will result in the U.S. Constitution's singular predecessor, the Articles of Confederation. But that's a story for another day. So you might be thinking, why do Americans celebrate independence on July 4th then? Shouldn't it be June 7th? Well, independence is coming, but like I said before, and I will say again, not all of the delegates agree. Fight the urge to romanticize and think that all the founding fathers agreed all the time. Richard's resolution is going to take all of June and some of July to get passed. On June 10th, Congress decides to pump the brakes. See, some moderates still aren't cool with this. Some of the colonies still aren't on board. In fact, it's later this very month, on June 19th, that the Patriots push the last royal governor of an American colony out of power. This, by the way, is New Jersey Governor William Franklin, son of none other than Benjamin Franklin. Yes, I'm serious. Just keep that in mind the next time you think your family has the most embattled arguments over politics. At least you're not on opposite sides of a revolution. But the point here is that, given these lingering moderate sentiments, especially in the mid-Atlantic colonies, Congress wants to wait 3 weeks before deciding on Richard's call for independence. In the meanwhile, Congress also sets up a 5-man committee to write a draft of this potential declaration they might make for independence. These include some familiar names such as Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. We also have Roger Sherman. We met him briefly in episode 5, but I'll remind you he's a Connecticut man. Our 4th member is New York's Robert Livingston. And finally, we have the man of the hour, Thomas Jefferson. Only 33 years old, Tom is about to learn the same lesson many A students doing group work in school already have. The rest of your group is going to bail on you and let you do almost all of it. Okay, joking aside, Tom is the principal author. Working on the 2nd floor of the red brick home of Jacob Graff, Tom cranks it out in about 2 weeks. Ben and John tweak it. The end result is a work of philosophy. This is where we find the ideas many Americans know by heart today, even if they can't necessarily place them. The most famous is perhaps that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Tom's also showing how well read he is. Many scholars, including myself, think Tom's paraphrasing the 17th century English philosopher John Locke, who wrote that, quote, "Man hath by nature a power, not only to preserve his property, that is, his life, liberty, and estate, against the attempts of other men." Tom basically replaced estate with happiness. Tom also goes on a mad diatribe against the British monarchy for creating slavery in the Americas. Let me read you a small bit of what he has to say on this point. Speaking of King George III, he says, quote, "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. He is now exciting those very people, slaves, to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another." I know, not what you'd expect from a slave owner. I'm telling you now, Tom is a complicated dude. We'll peel back the layers on him in due time. But for now, let's just unpack what he's saying, which is in and of itself a small peek into the mind of Tom. Basically, he blames the British monarchy for setting up the institution and sin of slavery in the Americas. And as a Virginian, Tom is certainly aware of the efforts made by Virginia's last royal governor to incite slaves to revolt as a way to suppress the Patriots. So by Tom's logic, the king is responsible for African Americans being enslaved. And now His Majesty would offer them freedom, but only in an attempt to deny European Americans freedom. Tom is conveniently, indirectly, absolving slave owners of practicing slavery. This is true. But it's still an astoundingly honest position for a slave owner to take, and it makes many of the other delegates uneasy, especially those from South Carolina and Georgia, who Tom says, to quote him, had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves and who, on the contrary, wished to continue it. Tom also tells us that others tied to slavery, even those from New England where the practice isn't nearly as rampant, don't appreciate it either. Still others just don't want to piss off what few friends they have left in England. That's why you may have never heard this part. It got cut out. The rest of the declaration is a list of all the sins charged against King George in Parliament. I don't think we need to restate those. You've basically heard them in the past 7 episodes, so I'll leave them alone. Let's get to the vote for independence. July 1st. Congress's 3-week wait on Richard Henry Lee's resolution for independence is up, and the debate is hot. Our favorite moderate, John Dickinson, gives a last-effort Hail Mary speech against independence right now. He eloquently states his fears of trusting foreign powers like France and Spain. He points to the potential fractures and infighting that could prove destructive down the road. I'm sure you won't be surprised, though, that John Adams then gets up and counters, saying independence needs to happen now. Well, the vote doesn't quite go John's way. See, for something of this magnitude to work, it's going to have to be a unanimous vote. Only 9 colonies vote in favor of independence. Lacking permission from their home colony to vote for independence, New York's delegates abstain. Delaware's delegates disagree. One votes for it, the other against. Since each colony only gets 1 vote, the stalemate basically renders Delaware void, but also shows dissent. Finally, South Carolina and Pennsylvania both vote no. Man, see what I mean about the Founding Fathers not always agreeing? But all is not lost. They will vote again tomorrow. It's a furious night of talking, persuading, convincing, and coaxing as the pro-independence delegates try to win over the moderates. Pennsylvania delegates Robert Morris and the now so familiar John Dickinson are convinced to simply find themselves perhaps absent during the vote tomorrow. Fellow Pennsylvanian James Wilson changes his mind from no to yes. So do South Carolina's delegates. New York will simply abstain again. That clears the way for 12 of the 13 colonies. But what about divided Delaware? Check this out. This is insane. Delaware has a 3rd delegate, Caesar Rodney. He's not in Philly, though. He's back in Delaware attending to the creation of a militia. Well, the pro-independence delegate, Thomas McKean, sends a letter to Caesar begging him to come back to Philly to stop the moderate anti-independence delegate George Reed from blocking the vote. Caesar gets the message, gets right on his horse, and rides straight through the night the whole 80 miles to Philadelphia and struts into the State House we now call Independence Hall like a boss, just in time to flip Delaware's tie into a pro-independence vote. And with that, we have a unanimous vote. On July 2nd, 1776, 12 colonies vote for independence with 1 abstention from New York. 0 votes against it. The next day, John Adams excitedly writes to Abigail, "The 2nd day of July, 1776 will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore." Huh. Okay, close, John. We do that on the 4th of July. Why? Well, although Richard Henry Lee's resolution passes on July 2nd, the little detail of finalizing what the Declaration would say happens 2 days later on July 4th, after a bit of editing, including cutting out Tom's diatribe against institutionalized slavery. I can see where John's coming from, but the document says July 4th, so that became the popular date. 56 men signed the Declaration. There's debate about when that happens, but it's over the course of the next few weeks or even months. A lot of signing happens on August 2nd. And of course, the Congress's president, John Hancock, signs it so big that today Americans ask each other for their John Hancock to say, "I need your signature." The story that he did so to make sure King George III could read it without his spectacles is legend. We have no proof that's why he did it. I think he signed it like that because that's just the popular, cool, ridiculously rich John being John. Okay, independence is declared, and loyalists are officially even more freaked out. But that'll do for our time in Congress. It's time to leave 18th century America's most populated city of Philly for its second largest, New York City. George Washington is about to suffer some incredible defeats in true desperation. But as we get to that, I think it's time to introduce you to 21st century America's arguably favorite founding father and adopted son of New York, Alexander Hamilton. Now, I should tell you, I'm an old school Alexander fan. I know everyone loves Alex since Lin-Manuel gave the world his Hamilton musical in 2015. And I do thank him for that. In fact, just in case he ever somehow listens to this podcast, dear Mr. Miranda, my gratitude knows no bounds. I am your obedient servant, G. Jack. What can I say? I'm a Hamilton hipster. I've been man-crushing on Alexander before it was cool. Just had to get that off my chest. You ready to meet him? Let's go to the Caribbean. Now, in my experience, most Americans today think of the Caribbean as a vacation destination, removed from the world. I need you to check that mentality. You might recall that in episode 1, I told you the French decided to keep 2 small islands in the Caribbean while giving up all of Canada in the treaty that ended the 7 Years' War in 1763. You remember? So these islands are valuable. Lucrative plantations producing sugar cane, aka white gold, thrive in the Caribbean climate. As a result, a cosmopolitan world exists as Europe's various empires struggle against each other for control while kidnapped Africans are sold and worked to death here as slaves. We can see this 18th century cosmopolitan world in Alex's parents. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was half English through her mother and half French through her father, who fled France and ended up on the island of St. Croix when King Louis XIV basically scared off Protestants by revoking the Edict of Nantes. Rachel had in fact inherited a small fortune upon her father's death. But her Danish husband, Johan Levin, blew through it quickly and ruined her life. He had her thrown in jail for a few months for alleged adultery. The charge may or may not have been true, but it landed her the reputation of a whore. The marriage was so awful, the teenage bride fled her husband and the island, even leaving behind her son Peter. She found greater love on the nearby island of St. Kitts in the arms of a Scotsman, James Hamilton. James grew up in a Scottish castle. No joke. But his fall from grace is about as epic as his son's ascent. As the 4th of 11 kids, he wasn't going to inherit crap, and so ended up in the Caribbean hoping, like so many European men there at this time, to make bank in a few years, then book it back home. That never happened. He met Rachel and had 2 sons, James Jr. and then Alexander, who was born on the British-controlled Caribbean island of Nevis on January 11th, 1755 or 1757. Whether his parents wanted to marry or not, they couldn't, because Rachel was a married woman. Rachel's husband enters the scene again about a decade later. Johann now divorces her so he can remarry, but get this, she is forbidden from ever remarrying. This dooms Alexander to bastard status and helps ensure he won't inherit much, if anything, down the road. His father then takes off at this point, possibly because of the divorce ruling, so Rachel isn't charged with bigamy, but that's not certain. What is certain is that his mom now has to provide for the boys by herself. It is interesting, though, that Alexander does stay in touch with his father through letters. At this point, in 1767, Rachel takes her 2 Hamilton boys and moves back to the Danish island of St. Croix, today a part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, by the way, where she runs a shop. They live on the 2nd floor above the shop, where there are, amazingly, 34 books. Quite fluent in French because of his mother, Alexander devours the likely multilingual works. This and some private tutoring, probably in part at the hands of a Jewish woman, were all the education Alexander receives. Oh, and why didn't he go to school, you might ask? Because he's a bastard, he's not allowed to attend the Anglican-run school. Now, it might seem Rachel's and her boys' sad tale has finally turned a corner. Nope, it's about to get much worse. The following year, in February 1768, Rachel and Alexander suffer from terrible fevers. Laying side by side in the same bed, his mother dies. The probate court then awards Rachel's meager estate to her legitimate and estranged son, Alexander's half-brother, Peter. Peter doesn't give a dime to his destitute half-brothers, but at least Alexander's uncle, James Lytton, intercedes to buy back Alexander's precious library of 34 books. Young Alex and James are entrusted to the care of their cousin, Peter Lytton. Shortly thereafter, Peter kills himself. He's found in a pool of his own blood on his bed. Peter's will takes care of his black mistress, Lygia, and their illegitimate son, but leaves nothing for James and Alex. The same uncle who bought back Alex's books tries to help out, but he dies shortly thereafter too. His will doesn't leave anything for them either. It's now 1769. James is 16 years old. Alexander is younger, maybe 14, Depends on what year he actually was born. And just to recap, Alexander has seen his mom's name dragged through the mud, his father bail, his legal status as a bastard deny him schooling, and his mother has been denied burial in a church graveyard. Also, he hasn't inherited a dime despite seeing more death by his teenage years than some people have by adulthood. Not to mention, he's seen a tough world where dueling is acceptable, pirates hang from the gallows, and slaves are worked so hard they often die within 5 years of being kidnapped, transported across the ocean, and sold to the sugar plantations. This is likely where his hatred of slavery develops, by the way. He saw its ugliness up close and firsthand. Talk about having to grow up quick. He and his brother split up. James turns to manual labor. Alexander, whose brilliance has shown through already, becomes a clerk at Beekman and Kruger. The future Secretary of Treasury gets a first-hand taste of international trade, moving sugar, rice, flour, cattle, rum, rope, and, on occasion, much to his displeasure, knowing what we do about Alexander's views, slaves. He deals in British pounds, pieces of 8, ducats, and other currencies. All the while, he dreams of something bigger. "I wish there was a war," Alex writes his friend Ned, then studying in New York. He gets his first taste for publishing in newspapers when his poems come out in the Royal Danish American Gazette. His big break, though, is a hurricane that rips through St. Croix on August 31st, 1772. He writes a letter to his father about its devastation. The Presbyterian minister Hugh Knox sees the letter before it's sent and tells Alex to publish it in the Royal Danish American Gazette. He does, and the readers are floored. How could a teenage kid write like this? This is how Alex writes his way out of the Caribbean. The business community, likely including a great deal of help from his cousin, Anne, raised funds to send this kid to study in New York. They probably hope he'll come back to St. Croix a well-educated doctor. Yeah, that ain't happening. Alex disembarks in Boston in 1772 or 1773 and heads straight to NYC. He makes his first friend, the Irish tailor Hercules Mulligan. Herc will introduce him to some more people. Meanwhile, Alex begins studying at Elizabethtown Academy, where he hits it hard, learning all the Latin, Greek, and math needed to get into college. These are things rich kids who get to go to school know, but Alex never got a chance to learn in the Caribbean. Soon he's accepted to Princeton by a very impressed Dr. Witherspoon, but the trustees refuse Alex's 2-year plan, so he goes to King's College instead. He enrolls around late 1773 to early 1774. Now things are heating up politically and Alex gets involved. The young Alexander ends up giving an impromptu speech on the Common near King's College on July 6, 1774. People are stunned at his eloquence as he defends the Boston Tea Party and denounces the Coercive Act's harsh treatment. Later, he gets into a war of words through pamphlets with the Anglican rector of Westchester, Samuel Seabury. The man of God plays off of Dickinson's famous Pennsylvania farmer pamphlet from a few years back by adopting farmer as his pen name. That's why Alex's second pamphlet in this war of words, which is 84 pages long and published on February 23, 1775, bears the title, The Farmer Refuted. After Lexington and Concord in April 1775, New York patriots start to gear up for war by forming militias and seizing arms. Alex is right there with them. He joins a volunteer militia, drills, and trains while studying up on military science. When George Washington passes through New York on his way to take command of the army in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Alex stands at attention as his future friend and boss inspects the troops at Wall Street. Alexander first got to demonstrate his bravery, though, on the night of August 23rd, which, oddly enough, you might recall from the last episode is the same day King George made his royal proclamation of rebellion. Anyhow, Alex numbers among 16 King's College volunteers who go to seize 24 cannons located at Fort George on the water's edge of Manhattan Island. After they had dragged 10 guns away, the British warship, the Asia, then sitting in New York's waters, begins to fire. Alex's crew fires back. At one point, Alex hands his musket to his friend Hercules so he can haul off more cannon. As Hercules puts it, "I was engaged in hauling off one of the cannon when Mr. H came up and gave me his musket to hold, and he took hold of the rope. Hamilton got away with the cannon. I left his musket in the battery and retreated. As he was returning, I met him, and he asked for his piece. I told him where I had left it, and he went for it, notwithstanding the firing continued, with as much concern as if the Asia had not been there. Yeah, Alex just coolly heads back into the worst of the Asia's fire and grabs his musket. That's how he rolls. Come March 1776, the same time George is scaring General Howe out of Boston, the hustling, scrappy, Caribbean-born scholar soldier gets promoted to artillery captain. His bravery and knowledge of trigonometry, his audacity, and networking are already paying off. Nice to meet you, Alexander. We'll reconnect throughout the next few episodes. But now that we're in New York and it's March 1776, it's time to take our focus off the Caribbean-born Scottish-English-French mixed descent immigrant and put it back on the Virginian general who's arriving in New York next month. After chasing General Howe and his crew from Boston, only General Ward and a small holding force remain in the city. George sends nearly the entire army to New York. When George arrives on April 13th, 1776, he immediately sets up his headquarters at No. 1 Broadway in this city of 20,000 people. He has no time to lose in preparing for the arrival of General Howe. Meanwhile, Howe's been in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where his armies reorganized, resupplied, and then, when they were good and ready, sailed off to New York. So George has had a good 2 months to prepare for Howe. This is somewhat interrupted when patriots learn of a loyalist assassination plot aimed at George, but this sounds more exciting than it really is. Of the dozen men arrested, only one man, Thomas Hickey, is found guilty and put to death by hanging. That happens on June 28th. The next day, George's officers spot Howe's ships through a telescope. A few days later, on July 2nd, the same day Congress passes Richard Henry Lee's Resolution on Independence, redcoats begin landing on the fertile farmland of Staten Island. Word of the Declaration of Independence soon reaches New York. George has it read aloud to his men and a crowd of New Yorkers on the evening of July 9th. Once the reading concludes, shouts and cheers fill the air, and soon the crowd turns into a mob. Armed with ropes and bars, they go down to Bowling Green and pull over the lead equestrian statue of King George III and decapitate it. Not lacking a sense of irony, the patriots melt the statue. The lead is used to make musket balls to shoot at His Majesty's troops. Little good these musket balls might do, though, against General Howe's massive army, including 9,000 or so German mercenaries called Hessians. Howe has over 30,000 men. George has less than 20,000. Further, New York is not Boston. Remember that in Boston, George had Howe trapped on the city's peninsula. Because of the geography, it was okay that George lacked a navy. New York, though, is a reverse situation where a navy can take out an occupying force fairly easily. See, in New York, we're talking about several islands: Manhattan Island, Staten Island, Long Island. And the rivers are a gift for a navy, too. The Hudson River, for instance, is deep enough for larger ocean-bound ships to pilot a ways up into the settled areas of New York. So this could be a rough go. And yet, General Howe first attempts peace talks with George. Remember, this isn't a scorched earth type of war. Howe thinks there are more loyalists than reality, and wisely knows he not only has to win the war, but the hearts and minds of the people. So Howe sends letters to George to open talks, but he addresses George as Esquire, not General. Because of that, George and his staff decide to reject the letter. Eventually, George agrees to meet one of General Howe's colonels, a man named James Patterson, on July 20th. When the colonel mentions talk of pardons and nothing more, George replies, "Those who have committed no fault want no pardon. We are only defending what we deem our indisputable rights." Well, that's failed. General Howe now turns to his military might. On August 27th, he crushes George's men at the Battle of Long Island. The Redcoats effectively use a strategy thought up by General Henry Clinton. He had previously noticed an opening in the Americans' defenses, which had been overlooked by several American generals, including George himself. And the Redcoats exploit it. They outflank American soldiers under the command of General Sullivan. Apart from a Maryland regiment, many of whom pay with their lives for their bravery, poorly trained, fearful Americans flee before the might of His Majesty's army. George suffers roughly 1,500 casualties, while thousands more desert. Most of these casualties are prisoners of war who will languish and often die on British prison ships. And yet, George is able to miraculously evacuate some 9,000 troops from Long Island because General Howe, possibly still hoping for peace, does not continue the attack. Under the cover of night and a fog that seems to be an act of God in favor of the Americans, George's men retreat across the river to Manhattan 2 days later. We really cannot overstate General Howe's attempts at peace. On September 11th, he sends his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, whose nickname is Black Dick. And no, I'm not making that up. It's a perfectly normal nickname for a guy named Richard with a dark complexion. To meet John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Edward Rutledge on Staten Island for peace talks. To keep it concise, I'll tell you it goes about as well as talks with George did back in July. On September 15th, George is bested again. 5 warships show up and open fire at Kip's Bay, and American militiamen, protected only by shallow trenches, flee once more. An angry General Washington rides out towards the skirmish where he witnesses Americans tossing their muskets aside and running. George rides after them, screaming. It's no use. In his frustration, George throws his hat and yells, "Are these the men with whom I am to defend America? Good God, have I got such troops as these?" Despite the advancing redcoats, he just sits there. George is utterly deflated. Finally, he's dragged off by his entourage, and just in the nick of time. A moment longer, and George would have been taken captive. The Americans must fall back once again, losing control of the southern part of Manhattan Island and essentially New York City itself. They take refuge in their fortifications further north, beyond the small 18th century city's limit, in Harlem Heights. The following day, September 16th, is the first break George catches in a long time. The redcoats get sloppy and advance to high ground across from the Americans in Harlem Heights, and George sees an opportunity to flank them. It works. It's a small battle. A skirmish might be a better word. But for the first time since they've been in New York, George can say he's had a victory and that he's made the British retreat. Psychologically, this was a much-needed win. But things are not about to start looking up for George. Within a week of this win, the British capture and execute his brave, untrained rookie spy, Nathan Hale. If you like AMC's American Revolutionary TV show, Turn, you might already know that although the show takes a lot of historical liberties, George Washington values good intel. You might also know that Nathan was a friend and Yale classmate of the Culper spy ring leader, Benjamin Talmadge. Well, following some of these losses we just discussed, 21-year-old Connecticut officer Nathan Hale volunteered to go back behind enemy lines to gather intel. This is risky business. In the 18th century, spying is considered undignified and worthy of death. He knew the risks, but took the job anyway. Now, how he got caught exactly on September 21st is unknown. It's possible his loyalist cousin Samuel Hale recognized him. More likely, he just trusted the wrong people with his true identity. We'll never know for sure. Interrogated by General Howe himself and carrying papers that clearly indicated he's a spy, Nathan confessed. Espionage is so loathsome in this era, Nathan had no right to a trial. He's hung to death the next day. Legend tells us Nathan's last words were, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Well, like almost all the good stuff, it's just that, legend. The account comes from another American officer named William Hull. William tells us he learned of Nathan's execution from a British officer who came under a flag of truce to the American camp. Once there, this British officer, who had witnessed the hanging, told William and artillery captain Alexander Hamilton about it. So we're in a bit of a game of telephone. Further, it contradicts another account of Nathan's final words published in the Essex Journal on February 2nd, 1777. To quote, "You are shedding the blood of the innocent. If I had 10,000 lives, I would lay them all down, if called to do it, in defense of my injured, bleeding country." Other historians have also speculated the line might have been a riff off of a then popular play, Cato. This line reads, "What a pity is it that we can die but once to serve our country. Whatever was said, we will never know. Still, this legend is similar to the whites of their eyes line at Bunker Hill. Here, too, the legend's words capture the essence of reality, regardless of whether they were or were not uttered. All who witnessed Nathan's hanging were impressed with the way the young American captain met his end. British Captain Frederick Mackenzie wrote, "He behaved with great composure and resolution, saying he thought it the duty of every good officer to obey any orders given him by his commander-in-chief, and desired the spectators to be at all times prepared to meet death in whatever shape it might appear." Our British first-hand observer does not offer a word-for-word account of Nathan's last words, but he makes it clear enough that the young Connecticut educator-turned-officer met death well and spoke of serving one's country to the bitter end. Okay, so New York leaves a lot to take in. Let's recap. In less than 2 months, George has lost Long Island, the southern part of Manhattan Island, including New York City, has lost thousands of men to injury, death, or as prisoners of war, and seen still thousands more desert or otherwise leave, including 6,000 of an originally 8,000-strong force from Connecticut. Meanwhile, Congress continues to fund short enlistments because they are cheaper than longer enlistments, and that means an eternal revolving door of soldiers who leave the Army about the second they start to have enough experience to do any good. It's no surprise, then, that in a letter to his cousin, Lund Washington, on September 30th, George laments, "In confidence, I tell you I never was in such an unhappy, divided state since I was born." Things aren't getting better either. Remember how I told you New York is basically made for a naval power to have its way with it? The British sail between Manhattan Island and Long Island up the East River on October 12th. They're able to box in the American army on Manhattan. Well, George can't have that, so he leads several thousand men north to try and hold them off. This leads to the Battle of White Plains on October 28th. It's another loss for George and another retreat in the dark of night as he holds up on the higher ground of Newcastle. This is also, by the way, about where the thin southern neck of New York State opens up to New England. Now things are truly desperate. George simply does not have enough men. If he moves from his position, he gives the Redcoats access to New England. But if he stays put, the Redcoats might move on the de facto colonial capital, Philadelphia. Further, George still has troops down south in the area of Harlem. The Americans have a fort there called Fort Washington that sits on the edge of the Hudson River. Directly across from it on the opposite western side of the Hudson, they also have Fort Lee. These two forts protect against the British Navy making use of this wide waterway. So they're important too. So, what to do? George splits his forces 4 ways. 1. Troops will stay at Fort Washington on New York's side of the Hudson. 2. Troops will stay at Fort Lee on New Jersey's side of the Hudson. 3. A good 7,000 troops will stay with General Lee where they are now, further north at Newcastle, so the Redcoats can't sneak off to New England. And 4. George is going to take a measly 2,000 or so men across the Hudson River to protect New Jersey and Philly. He's going to pray to God he can get more troops while in Jersey, and that, if all goes down on his side of the Hudson, Lee will be able to rush over and save him. How does this go? From dire to worse. George heads across the Hudson to Jersey on November 12th. Just after crossing, he's informed the British are moving with a massive force against the Manhattan-based Fort Washington. The poor Americans are such rookies at the art of war, they built too big of a fortification to protect. The British, who actually know what they are doing, noticed. They move in. George watches from the Jersey side of the Hudson at Fort Lee as the Redcoats take Fort Washington, including his nearly 3,000 men protecting it and a hell of a lot of cannon. Worse yet, it has a domino effect. Without Fort Washington, Fort Lee can't be defended either. Knowing this, George retreats, abandoning the fort to the British, who take it effortlessly on November 20th. George's reputation is in tatters. He hasn't looked this bad since he botched it at Fort Necessity in 1754, as I'm sure you recall from episode 1. People are doubting him. George's previous aide-de-camp and now Adjutant General Joseph Reed writes to General Lee on November 21st implying he wants Lee as Commander-in-Chief. Let me quote him. I do not mean to flatter, but I confess I do think that it is entirely owing to you that this army and the liberties of America, so far as they are dependent on it, are not totally cut off. Nor am I singular in my opinion. Every gentleman of the family, the officers and soldiers generally, have a confidence in you. Well, I don't know if everyone actually agrees with Joseph that Charles Lee is better than George, but I can name one officer who does. Charles Lee. That sneaky bastard writes to a buddy in Congress saying, quote, "Had I the powers, I could do you much good." After Forts Washington and Lee fall, George writes to Lee asking him to come help in New Jersey. You know, as was planned if things went bad. Seeing an opportunity to show his superiority, though, Lee doesn't initially come. George moves his freezing, broken army further west as General Hale follows. He crosses the ice-chunk-ridden Delaware River into Pennsylvania. A small glimmer of hope comes as George gains another 1,000 volunteer troops in Philadelphia, and as he hears on December 10th that General Lee is, after all, coming to his aid with a force of 4,000. And yet, as quickly as hope comes, it turns again to despair. Only 2 days later, on the 12th, General Charles Lee decides that rather than stay the night in camp with his men, he'll stay at a tavern a considerable distance away, run by a rather attractive widow, Miss White. The British capture Charles and take him prisoner wearing nothing but his nightgown. The same day, George learns that Congress has fled Philadelphia to seek refuge in Baltimore. And so, by late December 1776, George has been chased from New York across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. His reputation is in tatters with everyone doubting him, and he's lost his best general, albeit not a terribly loyal guy, Charles Lee. As a scared Congress takes flight, all George has left is a dismal, ill-equipped, malnourished, poorly trained rookie army in the dead of winter whose enlistments expire at the end of the month. George needs a miracle. A Christmas miracle? Thank you as always for listening. History That Doesn't Suck is a bi-weekly podcast. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe to ensure you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to connect with me or other fans, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook. Just search History That Doesn't Suck. Also, if you'd like to help keep History That Doesn't Suck going, please share it with your friends or consider a $1 or $2 subscription at patreon.com/History That Doesn't Suck. Doing so helps me keep the lights on, figuratively speaking. And with that, Merry Christmas, everyone. This week, you have a bonus. Seeing as it's Christmas Day, how can I not tell you the story of George Washington's 1776 Christmas gift for some unsuspecting Hessians? So join me right now in the Christmas special episode, where I'd like to tell you a story.